All right, we've got the last section of Unit 2, which is the bureaucracy. This is the area where most people who filled out the survey told me they wanted the review. Um, so bureaucracy, remember, refers to really the whole of the executive branch that's kind of not the president. The bureaucracy are all of those people who carry out the laws that Congress passes. Bureaucracy itself refers to the structure of organizations that are set up with rules and a hierarchy and kind of the way that they coordinate getting things done. So we use that example. If you go down here to the bottom, we had talked in class about thinking of the Cavs organization. You know, who are all the people beyond the players and coaches that really are instrumental in putting on a game? That's the bureaucracy, right? People know the president, people know the attorney general, secretary of defense. Yeah, great. But who are all those people who go to work in an office day to day for 25 years who are responsible for carrying out the laws of Congress? So you can obviously click on these to get a sense of what that stuff looks like. Here's a graph that we had used in class that kind of outlines, you've got the three branches, and here's the executive branch. And so, you've got the cabinet position, which is all those ones that maybe people are familiar with, but then you've got tons of other sub-agencies all organized within the bureaucracy that make things go. The main job of the bureaucracy, remember we had said if you're asked, maybe this would be FRQ number 2, if you're asked what's the main job of the bureaucracy, it is to implement laws, to administer the laws that Congress passes. Depending on the entity, they might also, what I would consider enforce the law, meaning something with criminal penalties or fines. And then obviously their job is to make rules and regulations, but number one, to carry out the laws of Congress. Let's talk a little bit about the difference between how the bureaucracy was staffed in its earlier days under President Andrew Jackson, and really all the way until the late 1800s, that used what was called the patronage system. And this idea that you would give bureaucratic positions to people as a reward for them supporting you. And particularly in those days, it was pretty darn corrupt. The people weren't qualified, they weren't any good at their job, but it didn't matter because they supported the president. Then the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883 changed that. It established the Civil Service Commission, which is going to set the guidelines for how hiring and firing and promotions and all that stuff will be done. The biggest change is now what we call the merit system in the bureaucracy and in our civil service. You have to be qualified. You have to show competency before you can get hired. Your promotions will be based on your skill set. You have to have attain certain educational levels in order to be hired. And so now more than 90% of the bureaucracy is covered by the merit system. You have some of those high-level positions either within the White House staff or the cabinet heads. That would be something that would be a little bit more political, but everybody else who staffs the agencies are covered by the merit system. All right, so the structure of the bureaucracy. You have the cabinet, which are the 15 departments that sort of make up the core of the bureaucracy. You can get links to this stuff. They're all headed by secretaries. They're hardly ever rejected, even though the Senate, of course, can use their check and maybe raise concerns about those nominees to provide a check for the president, but not confirming those doesn't happen all that frequently. Their job is to be an advisor, but of course the presidents don't really rely on their cabinet much anymore. It's more often on their own personal set of political advisors, but they're still obviously in charge of those agencies and the policies that those agencies are responsible to implement. The AP folks mentioned these ones, so I'm not going to read you what's on the page. You can do that, but these were ones that were specifically ID'd in the standards as departments that make rules and regulations. So here's a rough idea of what they do. The way they make the rules is going to be the same across all of those departments. And then it also had mentioned, I don't think that you need to memorize the difference between all of these per se, but this terminology here that you're seeing of independent agencies, these are bureaucratic structures that Congress set up that just simply, depending on the type, operate outside of the cabinet structure. It doesn't mean they're completely independent, although some do have a degree of independence different from the cabinet. I would be more concerned with these terms up here just to be familiar with them. Okay, so you've got executive agencies, which are things like the EPA. That's one that specifically was mentioned in that same set of standards, IDing important bureaucratic agencies. All of these are kind of the same as the cabinet. They're just not technically cabinet positions. They don't have cabinet status. The commissions are ones that do more of like the enforcing of the law. They're not only going to make rules, but they're also going to be given the power to enforce those rules and levy fines. And so these ones probably have the biggest degree of independence from the president because they're panels of multiple members. Usually they have to have political diversity, and they're going to have terms that outlast the president. And so there's not necessarily a ton that a president can do to influence what these commissions do. Congress is going to be the check on them by changing their job description or something like that. Again, the ones that were mentioned specifically in the standards, the SEC, the one that's going to regulate the financial markets, stock markets, banking, investments, all that kind of stuff. And then the FEC, which we talked about in our last unit before we started a review, and you should know what that's all about. And then government corporations. Again, the only thing is this vocab was mentioned in the standards. I'm not sure distinguishing between all these types is really going to be something you'll see. Just be familiar with these base ideas as vocab terminology: independent agencies, commissions, and government corporations. They're just, the post office is the best example, or maybe Amtrak. You pay for a service just like you would with a private entity. All right, so then this was an area where, of all the things in the bureaucracy, I got the most mention of concern: the rulemaking process. So remember, two different ways that the agencies are going to create rules. One is that Congress will pass laws that are vague. And so the bureaucracy has what's called bureaucratic discretion to determine what those vague terms will look like. Okay, so the agricultural marketing should be orderly. Well, that's what does that mean exactly? Which crops are covered? And so the bureaucracy is given discretion to make those determinations. The other way that the bureaucracy is going to be responsible for making rules is when Congress directly tells them to. Okay, they're going to make regulations where they will say right in the statute itself, such regulations as may be necessary. They're telling them, you develop the guidelines. We had done the practice in class of immigration stuff. Things like they should identify banned substances or banned items from being imported. Well, Congress is telling the bureaucratic agency itself, you guys develop the guidelines, you guys develop the list of things that are banned. And we had mentioned different reasons for giving the bureaucracy discretion. They're going to have much more expertise than members of Congress. Congressmen serve on multiple committees. They might come from different backgrounds than what those committees are, and so, yeah, I guess they're experts on that in that field for a congressman, but they're not people who have gone to school for that specific task. They're not people who have worked for 30 years in that particular field. I think Dr. Fauci is a great example of this. It's somebody who's served across multiple administrations. I think the earliest he was in that health leadership role was maybe George H.W. Bush, the first one. And he's just simply served in this position across multiple administrations, multiple parties. This is what he does. He's an expert in public health. And so that's why Congress gives so much authority to the bureaucracy, because they're realistically pretty good at what they do. And then the bureaucracy has the ability to make these rules in a much more streamlined way than what Congress does. They're also not going to have to deal with the politics of making these guidelines. They're not reelected, and so they're given the freedom in a way to use their expertise to develop the best guidelines possible. You can look at that on your own as an example of some of that stuff that Congress would ask the bureaucracy to do. I don't think you'll need to know the process, but it's simply Congress creates a law, the agency creates a rule, they put it out there publicly and allow for commentary, and then they make the rule official, and it goes in the Federal Register, and it has the same effect as any statute passed by Congress. And then the last part of this is controlling the bureaucracy and difficulty in doing so. The ones here in bold are the ones that are mentioned specifically in the standards. We talked about others. Congress can have oversight hearings where they bring in folks from the executive branch, people from the bureaucracy, to see if laws are being implemented the way they're supposed to be. And so they hold committee hearings for oversight in the same way that they hold those committee hearings for legislation. Power of the purse is the big one. They can change the funding of those agencies to affect how well they're able to do their jobs. So the power of the purse is a big one. We had talked about if Congress doesn't like the particular rules that an agency created, they can simply pass a new law to cancel those out. It's difficult to do, of course, because of the political divide, but it's certainly possible for Congress to cancel out rules of agencies they don't like. And then, of course, they can delay the appointments of those cabinet heads. We mentioned that already. The president has, obviously, as the chief bureaucrat, discretion and control over the agencies. He can appoint those heads, and those agency secretaries will often have the same political beliefs as the president. The president can issue executive orders that will modify and provide further directive for what the bureaucracy does. He can reorganize it, including fire cabinet heads that he doesn't like. Now, not necessarily the people who are there on the merit system, but he can for those heads of the secretaries in the same way that he can appoint them. And then he can propose Congress do things differently, and then that goes back to their check. But he can strongly urge Congress to alter the way the bureaucracy does its thing. The courts, we remember, can play a role in checking the bureaucracy, but because of that deference that they give to the agencies, it'll be a little bit more difficult for the courts to just simply strike down a rule. It's got to be something that's clearly contrary to what Congress wrote or intended. But a great deal of leeway is given to the bureaucracy to interpret vague language and then interpret their own rules themselves as they put those laws into actions. The biggest thing here in difficulty to control the bureaucracy is this. Some of the agencies are independent, like the regulatory commissions we talked about. They outlast the president. The civil service reform makes it bad to get rid of people who just simply you don't like. They have to be bad at their job to get rid of them. Iron triangles are the big ones. Remember, there's these relationships between bureaucratic agencies, congressional committees, and interest groups that are all working together for a common policy goal. And even if the president doesn't like it, it's going to be pretty difficult for him to break the way those iron triangles operate. So make sure you go back through your notes and take a look at some iron triangle stuff and how they support one another. Remember, issue networks are another one. The way to distinguish the two, issue networks are sort of those temporary alliances for a new policy idea. Iron triangles are forever. That's why they're iron. They're going to be around working on that policy, whether it's in the news or not. So that's it. If you have any specific questions, email me and let me know.